The whispers started before I even entered the room. I could hear them through the mahogany doors of my aunt's dining room. The familiar symphony of family judgment that had been my soundtrack for over a decade. "Oh, God, she's wearing another one of those weird vintage outfits." My cousin Madison's voice carried clearly. "I swear, it's like she's stuck in a time warp." Sure. That was my sister Jessica, but her stage whisper was louder than Madison's normal voice. "She'll hear you. And honestly, I think it's sweet how she makes the best of, her situation." I paused outside the door, smoothing down my 1950s circle skirt, a genuine Dior piece I'd found at an estate sale for $35, though they'd never believe it. The irony of standing outside a room full of people wearing mass-produced clothes from department stores while they pitted my cheap, vintage wardrobe wasn't lost on me. This was the Henderson family Christmas dinner, an annual tradition that felt more like a performance evaluation than a celebration. Everyone gathered to show off their latest achievements, their newest acquisitions, their most recent promotions. And then there was me, 32-year-old Sarah Henderson, the family's cautionary tale. "I heard she's still doing that. What do you call it, selling stuff online?" My Uncle Robert's booming voice dominated the conversation. At her age, you'd think she'd have figured out her life by now. "It's not her fault." My mother's voice was thick with the kind of maternal concern that felt more like disappointment. "Some people just aren't built for traditional success. Sarah's always been different." Different. That word had followed me my entire life. Different when I chose art history over business in college. Different when I quit my soul-crushing corporate job to pursue something I actually enjoyed. Different when I found fulfillment in hunting through thrift stores and estate sales instead of climbing corporate ladders. I pushed open the doors and stepped into the room, my vintage heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The conversation stopped abruptly and 17 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed pity. "Sarah!" My Aunt Patricia rushed forward, her arms outstretched in the kind of dramatic embrace reserved for returning soldiers or terminal patients. "You look lovely. That dress is so unique." "Thank you," I replied, accepting her hug. "It's actually a 1952 Christian Dior. Found it at an estate sale last month." The room filled with those polite murmurs people make when they don't quite know how to respond. I caught Jessica rolling her eyes at her husband, a gesture that said, "There she goes again, pretending her thrift store finds are something special." Dinner proceeded as it always did. My cousins talked about their promotions, their new houses, their children's private schools. My aunt and uncle discussed their recent cruise and their plans to renovate their kitchen. Jessica dominated the conversation with stories about her marketing director position and her husband's latest business ventures. And me? I smiled and nodded and deflected questions about my little online business, with vague responses that seemed to confirm their assumptions about my financial struggles. "Sarah, honey," my grandmother said during dessert, her voice carrying the weight of 87 years of well-intentioned meddling, "have you given any more thought to going back to school? Maybe getting an MBA? It's never too late to turn things around." Turn things around. As if my life was a car that had skidded off the road and needed to be righted. "I'm actually quite happy with what I'm doing, Grandma," I said, taking a bite of her famous apple pie. "But surely you want more security," Uncle Robert interjected. "More stability. What happens when you get older? When you want to buy a house, start a family?" I could feel the weight of their collective concern pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. They genuinely believed they were helping, which somehow made it worse than if they were just being cruel. "I'm actually doing quite well," I said, but my words seemed to bounce off them like rubber balls against a brick wall. "Of course you are, sweetie," my mother said, reaching over to pat my hand. "But we just want to make sure you're prepared for the future. Maybe Jessica could talk to her boss about opportunities at her company." Jessica perked up immediately. "Actually, yes. We're always looking for entry-level people. The pay isn't amazing to start, but there's room for growth. Real growth with benefits and a 401k and everything. Entry-level. At 32, with a business that generated more revenue than most small corporations, they wanted to find me an entry-level position. That's very kind, I said, but I'm really committed to my current work. But Sarah, Madison chimed in, don't you want nice things? Like real nice things? I just got this new Coach bag. She held up a purse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. And it feels so good to buy something quality, you know? Something new. I looked around the table at these people I loved, these people who loved me, and felt the familiar ache of being fundamentally misunderstood. They saw my vintage clothing, my modest lifestyle, my unconventional career, and they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions about what it all meant. What they couldn't see was the careful curation behind every choice I made, the hours of research that went into each purchase, the expertise I developed over years of studying fashion history, art movements, and market trends, the network of collectors, dealers, and auction houses that knew my name and trusted my eye. They couldn't see the vintage Chanel suit hanging in my closet that I'd bought for $50 and was now worth thousands. They couldn't see the mid-century modern furniture in my apartment that looked modest to them but represented a carefully chosen collection of museum-quality pieces. They couldn't see the first edition books, the original artwork, the antique jewelry that I'd rescued from neglect and ignorance. Most of all, they couldn't see the balance sheets that would have shocked them into silence. But I'd learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting. Some people are so invested in their version of your story that they can't hear alternative narratives. So I let them believe what they needed to believe, and I continued living my life on my own terms. After dinner, as I was putting on my vintage wool coat, a 1960s Pierre Cardin that had cost me $20 at Goodwill, Jessica pulled me aside. Sarah, I want you to know that we're all here for you, okay? I know things have been challenging, but you're not alone in this. Challenging. Another word that didn't match my reality, but fit perfectly into theirs. I appreciate that, Jess. I really do. And I meant what I said about my company. I could make some calls, set up some interviews. You have a college degree. That counts for something. We could get you back on track. Back on track. As if I'd derailed somehow, instead of simply choosing a different route. I hugged my sister and walked out into the crisp December air, my breath visible in small puffs as I made my way to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that ran perfectly and was completely paid off, though I knew my family saw it as another sign of my financial struggles. Driving home through the quiet streets, I thought about the antique jewelry collection I'd be appraising tomorrow for a client in Boston, about the estate sale I had scheduled for the weekend, where I hoped to find pieces for the private collector who'd commissioned me to build a collection of Art Deco accessories, about the museum curator who'd been asking me to authenticate a potential acquisition. I thought about my life, unconventional perhaps, but built exactly the way I wanted it, rich in ways that had nothing to do with money, though as it happened, I wasn't doing badly in that department either. But my family would continue to see what they expected to see, and I would continue to let them. Some truths, I'd learned, were too complex for Christmas dinner conversations. At least, that's what I thought until the day Jessica decided to stage her intervention. 3 weeks after Christmas, Jessica showed up at my apartment unannounced, armed with a laptop, a stack of financial planning brochures, and the kind of determined expression that meant she decided to save me from myself. "We need to talk," she announced, bustling past me into my living room before I could even offer her coffee. I watched as she set up what appeared to be a full presentation on my coffee table, a 1950s George Nelson piece I'd rescued from a garage sale, though to Jessica it probably just looked like old furniture. "Sit," she commanded, patting the cushion next to her on my vintage Eames sofa. "I've been doing some research, and I think I've figured out how to help you." "Help me with what, exactly?" "Your financial situation, Sarah. Your future. Your everything." She opened her laptop with a flourish. I know you've been struggling, and I know you're too proud to ask for help, but I'm your sister. It's my job to look out for you. I settled into my chair, a mid-century modern piece that had cost me $40 at an estate sale and was probably worth more than her entire living room set, and prepared for what I already knew would be an exhausting conversation. First, Jessica said, pulling up a spreadsheet, we need to establish exactly how much money you're making from your hobby. My business, I corrected gently. Right, your business. How much would you say you make in a typical month? I considered this question carefully. Last month had been particularly good. I'd sold a collection of vintage Hermes scarves for just over $40,000, and the Art Deco jewelry pieces had brought in another $30,000. But that wasn't typical, and trying to explain the irregular nature of high-end antiquities sales to someone who thought in terms of biweekly paychecks seemed like an exercise in futility. It varies, I said. Okay, but roughly. Are we talking hundreds? Low thousands? I almost laughed. It depends on what I find and what the market is doing. Jessica's expression grew more concerned. Sarah, you can't build a stable life on it depends. You need consistent income, benefits, a retirement plan. You're 32 years old. She launched into a presentation she'd clearly spent hours preparing. Charts showing the importance of steady employment. Graphs illustrating the power of compound interest in a 401k. Articles about the gig economy's lack of security. I've already talked to my boss, she continued, clicking to a new slide. There's an opening in our customer service department. It's not glamorous, but it's a foot in the door. $35,000 to start with health insurance and 2 weeks paid vacation. $35,000. I made that much in a good week, sometimes in a good day. But Jessica was looking at me with such earnest concern that I didn't have the heart to interrupt her presentation. And look, she said, pulling up another screen, I found some great resources for people transitioning out of unconventional work situations. There are classes for resume writing, interview skills, professional wardrobe planning. Professional wardrobe planning? Well, helping you find appropriate work clothes, office clothes, maybe some nice pieces from Target or TJ Maxx, affordable but professional looking. I glanced down at my outfit, a 1940s Maine botcher blouse that had belonged to a socialite's estate, paired with high-waisted trousers from the same era. The entire outfit had cost me $60 at an estate sale, but it was worth more than most people spent on clothing in a year. Jess, I said gently, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm really okay. But you're not, though. Her voice cracked with frustration. You live in this tiny apartment, you drive an old car, you buy all your clothes secondhand. That's not okay for someone our age. What if I told you I was happy? Happy doesn't pay the bills, Sarah. Happy doesn't give you health insurance or a retirement fund. What happens when you're 60 and you can't do this anymore? This, as if what I did was some kind of physical labor that would wear out my body instead of an intellectual pursuit that only got better with experience and knowledge. I stood up and walked to my bookshelf, running my fingers along the spine of a first edition Fitzgerald I'd found at a library sale. How could I explain that I wasn't just happy, but fulfilled in ways that most people never experienced? That I woke up every morning excited about what I might discover, what forgotten treasures I might rescue, what stories I might uncover. What if I told you, I said slowly, turning back to face her, that I make more money than you do? Jessica's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. Sarah, please. I'm a marketing director at a Fortune 500 company. I make 6 figures. What if I told you I make multiple 6 figures? Then I'd say you're in denial about your situation, and that's exactly why we need to have this conversation. The dismissal in her voice, the absolute certainty that she knew better than I did about my own life, finally broke something inside me. 15 years of gentle corrections, of patient explanations, of watching my family construct elaborate narratives about my struggles while I quietly built something extraordinary. It all came crashing down in that moment. "You know what?" I said, walking over to my desk. "Let's do this properly. Let's actually look at my finances." "Sarah, you don't have to prove anything to me." "No, I think I do." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. "You want to see my financial situation? Let's see it." Jessica's expression shifted from concern to alarm as I sat back down next to her. "Sarah, if you're in debt, we can figure out a payment plan." "I'm not in debt." I handed her my phone. "This is my checking account." She looked at the screen, blinked, and looked again. That says $230,000. That's just my operating account. The money I use for daily expenses and immediate business needs. Her face went pale. "This has to be a mistake." "No mistake." I took the phone back and swiped to another app. "This is my primary business account." The 7-figure balance seemed to take her breath away. She stared at the screen like she was trying to decode a foreign language. "And this," I continued, opening my investment portfolio, "is where I keep the long-term savings." Jessica made a sound that might have been a gasp or might have been a laugh. The number on the screen was approaching $9 million. "How?" she whispered. "The same way anyone builds wealth, Jess. By being good at what I do and making smart investments." She scrolled through the accounts with shaking fingers, her carefully prepared presentation forgotten on the coffee table between us. "But you shop at thrift stores. You live like what? Like someone who doesn't need to buy expensive things to prove her worth? Like someone who finds beauty in forgotten objects and gives them new life? Like someone who built a business around her passions instead of settling for a job that pays the bills? But why didn't you tell us?" Her voice was small now, confused and hurt. "I tried, Jess. For years I tried. But every time I mentioned my success, you all looked at me like I was delusional. It was easier to let you believe what you wanted to believe." The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique mantel clock I'd restored after finding it at a church rummage sale. $9 million, she said finally. "Give or take. It fluctuates with the market." Jessica closed my phone and set it carefully on the coffee table, as if it might explode. "I feel like the world's biggest idiot." "You're not an idiot. You just made assumptions. For 15 years, Sarah. 15 years of feeling sorry for you, of trying to help you, of treating you like the family charity case. I know." She buried her face in her hands. "Oh God, all those times I offered to lend you money. All those lectures about planning for the future. That job interview I set up with my boss. Which, by the way, I should probably cancel." Despite everything, Jessica laughed. It was a shaky, incredulous sound, but it was genuine. "You're really not going to take that customer service position?" Shocking, I know. She looked around my apartment with new eyes, seeing it perhaps for the first time as I saw it. Not a modest home that reflected financial limitations, but a carefully curated space filled with beautiful, meaningful objects that told stories and brought me joy. "That painting," she said, pointing to a canvas above my fireplace, "the one I always thought was kind of weird. 1940s abstract expressionist. Found it in a box of junk at an estate sale. It's probably worth about $20,000 now. And your coffee table. George Nelson for Herman Miller. $45 at a garage sale." Jessica shook her head slowly, a mixture of amazement and embarrassment playing across her features. "I don't understand. If you have all this money, why do you still live why don't you?" "Live like you? Buy expensive clothes and a big house and a fancy car to show everyone how successful I am." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it, though?" The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding and judgment. "I need to call Mom," Jessica said suddenly. and Madison, and Uncle Robert. Oh, God, Uncle Robert, and his lectures about financial responsibility. Jess, wait. She paused, her hand halfway to her phone. Maybe we don't tell everyone all at once. Maybe we just let this be a conversation between sisters for now. She studied my face, looking for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. You're not ashamed of your success, are you? No, but I'm also not interested in turning family dinners into discussions about my bank account. Money changes how people see you, how they treat you. I like being seen for who I am, not what I have. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. But they don't see you at all, do they? They see what they expect to see. Sometimes, I admitted, that's easier than the alternative. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true anymore. Maybe it was time for my family to see the real me, all of me. The phone call came 2 days later, just as I was getting ready to head to an estate sale in Beacon Hill. Jessica's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Sarah, I need your help. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I might be about to lose my house. I sat down heavily on my vintage vanity stool, a 1920s piece I'd restored myself, and listened as my sister explained how her husband's business venture had gone south, taking their savings with it. How the mortgage payments were already 2 months behind. How she'd been too proud to tell anyone in the family about their financial troubles. The irony wasn't lost on me. How much do you need? I asked. I can't ask you for money, Sarah. That's not why I called. I needed to tell someone, and after what I learned about your situation, you're the only person who might understand what it's like to keep up appearances when everything is falling apart. Jess, how much do you need? A long pause. 50,000 would save the house. But, Sarah, I can't. Consider it done. What? No. I wasn't asking for. I know you weren't asking. I'm offering. Family helps family, right? Another pause, longer this time. But what if we can't pay you back? Then don't worry about it. $50,000 isn't going to change my life, but losing your house might change yours. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, the sound of relief mixed with embarrassment and gratitude. I don't know what to say. Say thank you, and let's figure out how to transfer the money without creating a tax situation for either of us. After we worked out the details, Jessica was quiet for a moment before saying, I'm starting to understand why you keep your wealth private. Money really does change everything, doesn't it? It doesn't have to, I said, but it can. The trick is making sure it changes things for the better. That weekend, Jessica asked if she could come with me to an estate sale, not to stage another intervention, she assured me, but because she was genuinely curious about what I actually did for a living. We drove to a sprawling Victorian mansion in Newton, where the children of a recently deceased art collector were liquidating decades of accumulated treasures. Jessica watched in fascination as I moved through the rooms with purpose, my trained eye picking out pieces of real value among the clutter. How do you know? She asked as I examined a small ceramic vase. Experience, research, and instinct. This piece looks like it might be Rookwood pottery from the arts and crafts period. See the marking on the bottom? If I'm right, it's probably worth about $800. And they're selling it for? I checked the tag. $25. Jessica shook her head in amazement. It's like you're treasure hunting. That's exactly what I'm doing. I bought the vase, along with a collection of vintage costume jewelry, a pair of mid-century modern lamps, and a painting that looked promising. Total cost, $340. Potential value, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on authentication and market conditions. This is incredible, Jessica said as we loaded my purchases into the car. You're basically arbitraging between people who don't know what they have and people who do. Among other things, yes. But it's not just about the money. Every piece has a story. That painting we just bought, it might have hung in someone's living room for 50 years, watched over family dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings. Now it's going to find a new home with someone who will appreciate it for what it is. On the drive home, Jessica was unusually quiet. Finally, she said, "I owe you an apology." "You already apologized." "Not for the money thing." "Well, not just for that. For not really seeing you all these years. For projecting my own ideas about success and happiness onto your life without bothering to ask what actually made you happy." I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage and turned off the engine. "You want to know something funny? I used to think you had it all figured out. The corporate job, the house in the suburbs, the traditional markers of success. I thought maybe I was the one who was doing it wrong. And now I know there's no such thing as doing it wrong, as long as you're doing it authentically." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Jessica spoke again. "So what happens now? Do we tell the family?" I considered this. Part of me was tired of the charade, tired of letting people underestimate me and misunderstand my choices. But another part of me valued the authenticity of relationships that weren't colored by money and assumptions about what wealth meant. "What do you think would happen if we did?" Jessica laughed. "Madison would probably ask you to invest in her latest MLM scheme. Uncle Robert would want stock tips. Mom would start bragging about her successful daughter to all her friends. And they might start seeing you differently, but not necessarily for the right reasons." Exactly. We carried my estate sale finds up to my apartment, Jessica marveling at pieces she'd walked past for years without really noticing. I made tea served in vintage china cups I'd collected over the years, and we settled into my living room. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said, "What's it like? Having that much money, I mean." I thought about the question seriously. Mostly it's just freeing. I don't worry about bills or emergencies. I can be generous when people need help. I can take risks and pursue projects that interest me without calculating the financial return. But day to day, it doesn't feel that different from being comfortable. I still drive my old Honda. I still hunt for bargains. I still find joy in simple things. But you could buy anything you wanted. I could, but I've learned that wanting things and buying things aren't the same as appreciating things. The thrill isn't in the purchasing, it's in the discovering, the researching, the storytelling. The painting I bought today, I could afford to buy a similar piece from a gallery for 10 times as much, but that wouldn't give me the satisfaction of rescuing it from obscurity. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "So when are you going to tell everyone?" "Maybe never. Maybe someday. Maybe when it feels right instead of when it feels necessary. What about me? What am I supposed to do with this information?" "Whatever feels right to you. If keeping my secret feels like lying, then we'll figure out another way. But if you can accept that this is just who I am, someone who happens to have money but doesn't define herself by it, then we can just let things evolve naturally." 3 months later, at Easter dinner, something had shifted. Jessica still didn't mention my bank account, but she talked about my business differently. Instead of referring to it as my little hobby, she called it what it was, a successful antiquities and vintage goods business. Instead of offering career advice, she asked genuine questions about my work. The rest of the family noticed the change, though they didn't understand it. "Jessica seems to think your selling things is actually going well," my mother said over dessert, her tone suggesting she thought Jessica was being overly optimistic. "It is going well, Mom." "Well, that's nice, dear. But you know, success can be relative." "Actually," Jessica interjected, "Sarah's business is doing really well. Like really well." I caught her eye and smiled. She was walking the line perfectly, supportive without being revealing, honest without being dramatic. Uncle Robert, never one to miss an opportunity for unsolicited advice, leaned forward. "The thing is, Sarah, you can't count on unconventional work forever. You need to think about the long term." I am thinking about the long term," I said. "I'm quite comfortable with where I'm heading. But do you have a retirement plan? A 401k? Health insurance? I do, actually. All of the above. The surprise on his face was almost comical. In his mind, people who worked for themselves, especially in creative or unconventional fields, were automatically financially irresponsible. Well, he said, clearly scrambling to maintain his position as the family's financial advisor, that's good. But you should still consider diversifying. Maybe some real estate investments, or... Uncle Robert, Jessica said with a grin. I think Sarah has her investments figured out. After dinner, as the family dispersed to their various cars, Madison cornered me in the driveway. Okay, what's going on with you and Jessica? She's acting all mysterious about your business, and you seem different. Different how? I don't know. More confident, like you know something we don't know. I smiled, thinking about the Tiffany lamp I'd authenticated the week before, the museum consultation I had scheduled for Monday, the private collector in San Francisco who'd commissioned me to find a specific piece of Art Nouveau jewelry. Maybe I do, I said. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. I was still the same person, living the same life, making the same choices. But having one person truly see me, truly understand what I'd built and why I'd built it, had shifted something fundamental. I pulled into my parking garage and sat for a moment in my old Honda, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my chosen life. Tomorrow I had an estate sale to attend, a collection to appraise, and a business to run. I had work that fulfilled me, financial security that freed me, and now, finally, a family member who saw me for who I really was. Maybe that was worth more than $9 million. Maybe.